Welcome to Life Stories, where real experiences shape powerful lessons. Imagine being kicked out at 16. Left with nothing but an old van and a world that barely notices you. Surviving was tough. But rebuilding a life, even tougher. Years later, when I finally had a home of my own, the people who abandoned me came back, asking for help. What would you do? This is a story of resilience, betrayal, and redefining family. Subscribe now to Life Stories and join us as we dive into today's powerful journey. The night my father told me to get out. The air was sharp with the first bite of October cold. It had started, like so many other nights, with something small, something so insignificant that I can't even remember it now. Maybe I left my shoes by the door. Maybe I rolled my eyes at the wrong moment. Maybe he was just waiting for an excuse. Either way, it spiraled. It always did. His face turned red, his voice rising like a storm gathering force. My mother stood in the corner, head bowed, staring at the floor like the answer to everything was written on her shoes. "Get out, Jake," my father growled, pointing at the door. I froze. Surely, he didn't mean it. Surely, this was just another one of his threats. The kind that always ended with a slammed door and my mother whispering apologies in the morning. But something in his eyes was different this time. It was final. I turned to my mother, searching for a sign, a flicker of hesitation, anything to show me this wasn't real. But she wouldn't meet my gaze. I felt something inside me crack, something deep and painful that I wouldn't understand for years. Without another word, I went upstairs, grabbed my backpack, and stuffed in whatever clothes I could find. A pair of jeans, a few t-shirts, my old hoodie. The house was silent except for the pounding of my heart. When I stepped out onto the porch, the cold hit me like a slap, but the door behind me was already shutting, the porch light flicking off as if to erase me completely. For the first time in my life, I knew what it felt like to be truly alone. I had an old Chevy Astro van, a battered, faded blue thing with a cracked windshield and a faint smell of mildew that never quite went away. It wasn't much. But when I turned the key, the engine rumbled to life. And suddenly, it was the only home I had. That first night, I parked behind a Walmart, wrapping myself in my hoodie, staring up at the van's ceiling. I kept waiting for my phone to ring, for a message to come through, for my mother to open the front door and call me back inside. But no one called. No one came. The first few weeks were the hardest. I had $40 in my pocket and whatever loose change I could scrape from the van's floor. Gas became more valuable than food if I couldn't move the van. I wasn't safe. I learned quickly where to park, behind big stores like Target and Walmart, where security guards didn't bother you as long as you didn't cause trouble. I wasn't the only one, either. Some nights, I'd see other cars parked nearby, other people like me, trying to disappear. The van became my entire world. I folded the back seats down into something that resembled a bed, though the metal bars dug into my spine no matter how many layers I piled on top. I hung an old towel over the rear window for privacy. My backpack stayed tucked under the passenger seat, close enough to grab in case I had to leave in a hurry. But surviving wasn't just about finding a place to sleep. It was about staying invisible. People don't notice you when you keep your head down, when you don't make noise, when you learn to blend into the background. But invisibility was a double-edged sword. There were nights when drunk men knocked on my van's windows, laughing, looking for trouble. Once, someone tried to pry open the passenger door while I was sleeping. After that, I kept a tire iron under my seat. Finding work was nearly impossible. No high school diploma, no address, nothing to my name. I walked into fast food places, gas stations, grocery stores, anywhere that might be desperate enough to take me. Most didn't even look at me. Then, finally, I found Donna's Diner. It was the kind of place with greasy floors, the scent of old fryer oil in the air, and waitresses who'd been there longer than I'd been alive. Donna herself was a woman with nicotine-stained fingers and tired eyes that had seen too much. She barely looked at me when I asked for a job. "Do you have an address?" I hesitated. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "All right, kid. Show up on time. Don't steal. And don't piss off the cooks." I nodded so fast my neck hurt. I washed dishes for 14 hours straight that first day, until my knuckles bled from the industrial soap and scalding water. When the diner closed at 2 in the morning, I drove back to my usual Walmart parking spot, locked my doors, and collapsed onto the van's seat. I was exhausted, but I had made it through the day. Winter was the worst. Some nights, I curled up in the driver's seat, my knees pulled to my chest, trying to breathe warmth into my frozen fingers. I layered every piece of clothing I owned, but it was never enough. Sometimes, I'd drive around just to let the heater run for a few minutes. But gas was too expensive to waste. I showered at the YMCA after saving up for a cheap membership, washed my clothes in gas station sinks, dried them under hand dryers. I learned which places didn't care if you lingered too long, charging your phone near the soda machines. I learned how to survive. But I wasn't living. I was drifting. Just another nameless shadow in the world. I told myself that one day, I'd escape this. That one day, I'd have more than a van and a diner paycheck. But I didn't know when. And I didn't know how. The days blurred together. One long stretch of exhaustion and survival. I woke up with the sun because the van turned into an oven by mid-morning. And I worked until my body ached. I learned how to scrub plates so fast I could keep up with the dinner rush without thinking. My hands were always red and raw from the scalding water. But I didn't complain. Complaining got you fired. By the time I turned 18, I had saved a little money, not much, but enough to move out of the van. I found a tiny room in the back of a mechanic shop. The kind of place that smelled like oil and burnt rubber no matter how many windows I left open. The walls were thin, the ceiling low, and the mattress on the floor was lumpy and stiff. But I could lock the door behind me, and that meant something. With the weight of the van off my shoulders, I took on extra shifts, 70 hours a week, bouncing between the diner and a gas station down the road. My body ached. My eyes burned. But I was surviving. That was when I started to notice how much time I had spent disappearing. I had become an expert at making myself small, at blending into the background. Even at work, people barely noticed me. I could move through an entire shift without anyone saying my name. I was a part of the environment, like the hum of the kitchen fan or the flickering fluorescent lights. And I thought I was okay with that. Until Charlie came along. Charlie lived in an old rusted-out van, one of those relics from the 80s with doors that barely closed properly. He had been on the streets for almost 10 years. A veteran in the art of survival. "You keep to yourself too much," he told me one night, leaning against my van with a cigarette hanging from his lips. "That's why you feel so damn alone." I wanted to tell him he was wrong. That I was used to this. That I didn't need anyone. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. Charlie taught me things no one else had. How to keep condensation from building up in the van so I wouldn't freeze at night. Where to park when I needed somewhere safe. Which gas stations didn't care if you stood outside for hours charging your phone. And most importantly, he taught me that no one survives alone forever. But even Charlie was temporary. One night, he simply vanished. His van was gone from its usual spot behind the Walmart. His cigarette butts no longer littered the pavement. I never saw him again. And that was when I realized this life didn't hold on to people. It swallowed them whole. I didn't want to disappear. So, I made a choice. I saved every extra penny, every dime that I didn't need to survive. And I poured it into one thing, getting out. It took 3 years. 3 years of exhaustion. Of fighting against the feeling that this was all I would ever have. 3 years of watching people like Charlie fade into the background. Knowing I could be next. But then, One cold autumn morning, I signed the papers. The house was tiny, barely more than a glorified shed. But it was mine. I sat on the bare wooden floor of the empty living room. My fingers curled around the keys. And for the first time in my life, I cried. Because no one could take this from me. No one could kick me out. And I had finally stopped disappearing. The year after I bought the house was the hardest. But it was mine. And that was enough. I spent my days working. And my nights fixing it up, watching hours of YouTube tutorials on plumbing, electrical work, and drywall repair. My hands were always covered in paint. And my muscles ached from tearing out old, rotting floorboards. But the more I worked, the more the house started to feel like something real. It wasn't much. A thrift couch, a mattress on the floor, a wobbly dining table I found at a yard sale. But it was home. It was safe. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. There was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. My mother stood there, clutching her purse like a shield. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, his face tight with something I couldn't quite read. And behind them, peeking out from under his hoodie, was Ethan. Except he wasn't so little anymore. He was 16, the same age I had been when they kicked me out. "Jake," my mother said softly. "Can we come in?" I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed to slam the door in their faces. But then I saw Ethan's eyes, wide, unsure, silently pleading. I stepped aside. They walked in like they belonged there, like they hadn't thrown me out into the cold years ago. My father went straight to the kitchen, opening the fridge without asking. My mother sank onto the couch, sighing like she was finally relaxing after a long day. And Ethan hovered near the door, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes flicking between me and our parents. I didn't have to wait long for the reason they came. "We've hit some hard times," my father said, clearing his throat. "Lost the house. Money's tight. We just need somewhere to stay for a while, just until we get back on our feet." I stared at him, at my mother, at Ethan. After all these years, after everything, now they wanted my help. But then Ethan looked at me again, his face pale, his shoulders tense, and I felt my chest ache. I agreed. 2 weeks. That's what I told them. 2 weeks. And then they had to go. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't going to end well. For the first few days, I tried to convince myself it might work. My parents took the guest room, a space I had barely finished painting 2 months ago. Ethan slept on the couch in the living room. I set boundaries. I made it clear. 2 weeks. No exceptions. But boundaries only work when people respect them. And my family, they had never been great at that. At first, it was the little things. My father leaving his dirty coffee mug on the kitchen counter every morning, even though the sink was right there. My mother rearranging the pantry because it makes more sense this way. And then there were the passive-aggressive texts from Aunt Karen, dripping with fake concern. "Hope you're not too overwhelmed having everyone there. Family is a lot of work." Huh. But Ethan was different. He was quiet, careful. He folded up his blanket every morning. He put the couch pillows back neatly. He offered to help with dishes, with yard work, with anything that might lighten the load. One night, about a week in, I found him sitting on the back porch, his hoodie pulled up, knees drawn to his chest. I sat beside him. "Everything okay?" I asked. He shrugged, staring out at the overgrown yard. "They're fighting again." I sighed. I had been hearing it too, muffled arguments seeping through the thin walls of the guest room. "Is that normal for them now?" I asked. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, pretty much. Every day. Sometimes over money. Sometimes over nothing at all. Dad's angry all the time now. Mom just cries. And Aunt Karen, well, she stirs it all up again." We sat in silence for a while. the cold night air settling around us. Then Ethan said something that made my stomach twist. "They told me you ran away," he murmured. "That you left because you didn't want to deal with them anymore." My chest tightened. "That's not what happened," I said softly. "I know," he replied. "I figured it out. Aunt Karen let it slip last year." I clenched my jaw, swallowing down the anger rising in my throat. They had lied to him. They had made me the villain. And Ethan, this quiet kid, who deserved so much better, had been caught in the middle of it. I took a slow breath. "Ethan, when the 2 weeks are up, you can stay. You don't have to go back with them." He hesitated, staring down at his hands. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. "I mean, they're still my parents. You know?" I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. The night my parents left, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. No more arguing behind closed doors. No more tension filling every room. Just silence. Ethan and I sat in the living room, neither of us saying much. He clutched his phone like it might anchor him to something solid. His backpack still zipped up tight, like he wasn't sure if he was really allowed to stay. "You don't have to sleep on the couch," I said quietly. "The guest room is yours now." He hesitated. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "Yeah. It's yours." For the first time since he arrived. He smiled, a small, hesitant thing, but real. Over the next few weeks, he slowly settled in. At first, he tiptoed around, always asking permission. "Can I use the shower? Can I grab something from the fridge?" But little by little, that faded. I helped him enroll in high school. And when they asked for an emergency contact, he looked at me. "Put me down," I said. He stared for a moment, like he couldn't believe it. Then he wrote my name. Months passed. He graduated. I sat in the audience, clapping as loud as I could, taking blurry pictures. Later that night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he spoke softly. "You saved my life, Jake." I shook my head. "No, man. You saved your own life." He smiled again. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Because family isn't about blood. It's about who stays. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more real-life experiences.